Hello, my name is Tim Flocka, and I am the co-founder and executive director of Commonwealth. And I'm incredibly pleased to welcome you to this panel on building an inclusive tax system. We have fantastic panelists today who represent just great experience in government at federal and local levels, in the social sector, in philanthropy, in the private sector. And I'm super excited to get the conversation started. I did want to briefly introduce, as I said, I have the privilege of leading a national nonprofit named Commonwealth, and our focus is financial security and opportunity for the people who need it most, working people in this country who are, we know, disproportionately people of color and women. And we do that work through innovation and through partnerships. And over the past 20 years with that mission, we have really intersected with the tax system a lot. And that means not just tax policy, but as we'll talk about today, how that policy is actually administered in the real world and how it touches down in real families' lives. At moments that has meant really making the link between large tax refunds and saving possible through something called split refunds, and later through an option to purchase US savings bonds right through the tax filing process. And over this past year, when we saw a sort of looming crisis that many families who rely on the earned income tax credit might not be eligible for it after unemployment last year, we rallied together with two other organizations, Saver Life and Neighborhood Trust, and launched a campaign to make families aware of a provision Congress passed called the Look Back. You can read more about that on a website called taxcrisis.org. But as we switch to the panel, one of the few perhaps remaining rituals that nearly everyone in this country participates in is filing an annual tax return. Last year, nearly 170 million households filed tax returns. And while the popular notion may be that this is everyone doesn't like taxes and doesn't like to file taxes, the reality is that the overwhelming majority, 125 million households, receive refunds every year. And in a recent year, the average refund was nearly $2,900. So for households at the median income in this country of about $65,000, that's closing in on 5% of their annual income in a single moment. And of course, as we think about households on lower incomes, the importance of both those refunds and frankly, the size of those refunds rises. So with that context, we now have several rounds of economic relief payments, and most recently, the American Rescue Plan Act passed earlier this year. And now the tax system is just even more important with so much more at stake. So with that context, I'm incredibly excited to be joined by a fabulous panel. And I wanted to start the conversation today by asking them all to just briefly introduce themselves. And they each come, as you'll see, with really different experience of the tax system, and to just say a few words, given their experience, about what they see as the potential of this enormous infrastructure that, as I say, almost every household in the country touches every single year. To get us started, Ashley, why don't you take the first response?
Great, thanks, Tim. Hello, everyone. I'm Ashley White. I'm the director of the Economic Mobility Lab at the City of Boston. We primarily research and test innovative solutions that help promote economic mobility for Boston's low to moderate income residents. And as you know, we've concentrated on work like childcare, emergency savings, and then most recently really focusing on this tax time season and working with Commonwealth to spread awareness about the look back. In terms of the potential and role of the tax filing system, you know, the first thing that sort of came to mind was the depth and breadth of this system, and how much potential I think it has to be, you know, a power to redistribute wealth, you know, throughout the U.S. So just an example, the earned income tax credit, you know, in 2018, I think it was $65 billion were spread across tax filers via refunds, and 97% of that went to families, and 5.8 million people were moved out of poverty because of that tax policy. So, and we also know that, you know, the families who receive those refunds use it on really important things that provide financial stability, like you know, home improvements, repairing a car, school supplies for their children, paying down debt, bills, that sort of thing. So really important necessities for families to sort of stay afloat. So I think that the system has a lot of power, a lot of potential. Obviously, there are a lot of flaws, which I think we'll get to later. But then also, with the addition of the American Rescue Plan Act, I think that really shows how much power this system has with the expansions that the Biden administration was able to put through Congress. So.
Thanks, Ashley. Don, how about you?
Yeah, sure. Don Baylor Jr., currently a managing director at Lafayette Square Holding Company, which is a newly created Black-owned, impact-driven asset management firm focused on affordable housing, good jobs, and financial inclusion for asset managers and the broader LMI population. Before that, and so we are committed to providing access to free tax prep within our affordable housing properties as we stand those up over the next decade, in which we hope to house 100,000 residents and create 100,000 jobs with low and moderate income companies. Before that, I was at the Center for Public Policy Priorities, now Every Texan, where I both coordinated a statewide tax time savings campaign, largely around savings bonds and other vehicles, but also advocated in the State House around new access for EITC as well as community tax centers, and was part of a statewide coalition of community tax centers. And so it's really a pleasure to be here and really kind of elevate the importance of community tax infrastructure within the system. Within the federal tax filing system. I think when we think about the American Rescue Plan, I think about 529s and children's savings. And so we do know that there is a huge children's savings gap, including a 529 savings gap, both by race as well as by income. And so thinking about ways to get creative about how we might be able to provide additional support for families to open up CSAs if they do not currently have one. And so being able to match their credentials, with various state 529 programs with the tax filing system, I think would be a real way to expand access as well as, build awareness about the importance of saving for college.
Thank you, Don. And Fred, how about you?
Thanks, Tim. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for the hosts of this program. It is both timely and central to what needs to happen. Personally, I am currently at Skadden Arps of Council. I am at a point in my career where I get to spend some of my time on tax, the other half my time on pro bono, public interest, diversity, and equity issues in underserved communities. But prior to that, at various points in my career, I have served as the IRS Chief Counsel, I have served as the IRS Commissioner, and I have served as the Assistant Secretary Tax Policy. So this subject is very near and dear to my heart. And the IRS is far more than an law enforcement agency. A better way to think about the IRS, it is far and away the largest, most inclusive financial platform in our country. Now, there are folks who slip through the cracks because they don't file returns. Those tend to be the most vulnerable, most disadvantaged, and disproportionately members of minority communities. But what the IRS does in terms of its reach to the American people is massive. And the possibilities are endless. As Don mentioned, as Tim mentioned, as Ashley mentioned, the most recent legislation goes a far way towards the social safety net. But as we move forward, it's important to rethink, to some extent, the IRS role. As we broaden the social safety net, if we focus on issues such as emergency savings, as we focus, as Don mentioned, on savings accounts for children, as we consider what technology can do today, both for better and for worse, it's important to think through what the IRS mission is. In the short run, the single most important thing the IRS can do is effectively implement the expanded child tax credit. That is a transformative proposal. But beyond that, how does the IRS think about its job? Is its job to chase the cheats? For sure, the tax gap is a horrendous problem. But the IRS also has the capacity to deliver important pieces of what Congress intends. And what Congress intends is to make it work right for everyone, minority communities, low-income communities, and that's the job. Thanks.
Well, no surprise, you guys have all illustrated exactly the point that the tax system, the IRS, communities that help deliver the tax experience, the possibilities of wealth creation, there's enormous potential. What I'd like to turn the conversation to is, what is it going to take to realize some of this potential? Who are the actors who need to do what jobs? And again, each of you have a wide variety of experience, so I think we'll hear some different answers on the who needs to do what side of this. And Don, why don't we start with you? From your perspective, who needs to do what to seize some of this potential?
Yeah, I mean, I think wearing a former funding hat, I was always just surprised at how much successful community tax programs had to scramble for funding. And in my opinion, it should not have to be that way. In many ways, whether or not it's through digital or through face-to-face, they are critical connective tissue between communities and the IRS. And so we need to find permanent. I know that there is a federal program that does this at $30 million a year. That I think has been a very positive development to support those. But I think that we need to go further in terms of local funding, as well as state funding, as well as philanthropic funding, to make sure that there's adequate resources to reach hard to serve communities. And I think hard to serve communities are called that for a reason, because it takes longer and it may cost more to reach those folks, but it is critical, and as Fred said, aligned with the intent of Congress with this particular legislation. And I do think at the federal level, really thinking about how we really use and leverage the full organs of the federal government. I think about housing, from Fannie Mae to Freddie Mac, what they can do in their financing of multifamily, as well as the portfolio that HUD oversees. And so I think that I think this really requires an interagency approach, which I think child poverty obviously requires that type of approach. But I think CTC, IRS, and Treasury need to be, really at the center when we think about an interagency approach to child poverty, as well as family economic security.
Thanks, Don. I was struck that I'm not sure when people think about taxes, they always recognize, to your first point, the role of communities and community organizations. And I think that's a great segue. Ashley, I think you can speak to some of this from your experience. Can you paint that, tell us how communities and local government plug into this?
Yeah, thanks. I think it is a good segue. So I think as Don was saying, the community sort of tax preparation sites are really, really important. And from my perspective, played a big role in what we've done in Boston over the past couple months. So we call them VITA sites. They're free tax preparation services to Boston residents. And in Boston, the VITA sites in 2019 served over 12,000 taxpayers. And that was an average return of about $2,000. And so they play a big role in tax preparation and making sure that folks get their refunds. But what we had to do this tax season, because it was so complex and there were all these sort of new policies with the look back, it took an immense amount of coordination, which I think Don sort of alluded to. I think the city is certainly well positioned to be the one to be that convener, because we are on the ground. We know the community, we know the players. But for us, we were taking out advertisements in different ethnic media. We were coordinating with the Office of Neighborhood Services. We were talking to external stakeholders like United Way, really trying to make sure that we got this message out in every way possible and using all the different levers that the city had at arm's length. But then the last thing too that I would say in terms of resources, right? It takes all that coordination, and some of these sites and some of these agencies are, lacking in the resources to reach even more people than I think we have. And so I would say too that to realize some of this potential, more federal funding, grants. I know Don mentioned one, but continuing to invest in these localities, invest in these nonprofits, these community-based organizations to make sure that they can reach those vulnerable communities would be ideal.
Thanks, Ashley. And Fred, you've been at the very center of the other side of the table in what it's like to run the IRS. Maybe you can give us your perspective on who needs to do what.
Sure, Tim, and having been lucky enough to run both tax policy and the IRS, there are all sorts of policies. There are all sorts of theories. There are all sorts of ideas. The issue is what Don is saying and what Ashley is saying. It's all in the execution. I can sit up there in my penthouse and make all these great theories to help vulnerable communities, but it happens downstairs in the street. And that's what's so important here is the execution. Let me give you a simple example. Most taxpayers, when they file their returns, provide enough information to know whether they're eligible for the earned income tax credit, the child care credit, child tax credit. Is the IRS job to chase the ones they think are cheating? Or is an important part of the IRS job to reach out to those who don't claim what Congress intended and let them know? There's an awful lot of emphasis on the former. There's not much emphasis on the latter. The second point goes to what Ashley was saying. The IRS reaches lots of folks, but it doesn't reach everybody. The homeless, the most vulnerable among us. Well, who has that information? Ashley's got that information. Boston has got that information. And I agree with Don on collaboration and cooperation among federal agencies, but the partnership, if this is going to work, needs to be with state and local governments, because Ashley, you're the folks who knows what's going on. Thanks, Tim.
That's fabulous. One of the things we talked about when we were chatting ahead of time, getting ready for this, was this concept of reverse engineering, really starting with who are we trying to reach, because we have good reason to think they are hard to reach. And then how do we work backwards from who knows them, who has relationships, who has the data, who has the experience. And that was certainly going through my mind, listening to this last round of answers. I think we've touched on this already, but I did want to just take a moment, if there are particular challenges in trying to realize this world where the tax system works for everybody and the enormous sums of money that already flow through it, and we'll talk about this more in a minute, the additional sums under the American Rescue Plan, are there particular challenges that we haven't really shined a light on yet, especially for this audience who are enormously capable and sympathetic to the cause? It might be useful to kind of point out some of the extra things we need to keep an eye on. Fred, can I come back to you first on this? Is there anything you haven't had a chance to weigh in on in terms of challenges?
Tim, I'm a broken record, man. It's all in the execution. And the IRS has been systematically hammered for more than a decade. The IRS needs more funding. And again, not just for enforcement, but to fulfill its compact with the American people. Service is just what matters most, because most of us, most families in America, they get a W-2. The information is there, but it shouldn't take hours or days to reach the government. So service matters as well. The second piece is long-term funding. No person would ever dream of running a business where they got an annual budget with no idea whatsoever what the next year's budget was going to be. You can't do anything that way. So it's more funding, it's long-term funding, and it's technology. The same technology that can deal with upper income folks who aren't paying what they owe is the same technology that can work for the rest of the country. So it's long-term funding, it's technology, and it's a reorientation towards serving everyone in these, particularly the hard to reach communities, like what Don was talking about, the folks who live in Boston, like what Ashley was talking about. So that's what they need.
I really, really appreciate that comment coming from you, Fred, because I think it's not always the first thing that comes to mind that we need to think about the IRS itself and making sure that it has the resources to do the things that we all now increasingly want it to do to achieve the policy outcomes. So I think that's really, really important. Ashley, I wonder if you want to.
Tim, can I make another comment, Tim?
Of course you can.
This is the most exciting time for an old guy who used to live with the IRS in 40 or 50 years, because the Congress of the United States, this administration, is paying attention to what a desperately underfunded, undersupported agency can do. And I'm just getting out of bounds here, Tim, but here's the plug. You've got a very receptive Congress. You've got a very receptive administration to get at both this giant tax cap, principally at the high end, and the needs of these communities. So let's all give them a cheer and hope it happens. Sorry, apologize.
No apology needed. No, that's great. Ashley, is there anything you want to pick up on this one?
Yeah, for sure. I think just two things before I get to a bigger chunk that I wanted to touch on. But one is, the burden of all this is really on the taxpayer, right? Especially when it came to the look back, right? The policy was created, but it was really on that taxpayer to kind of figure out, how do I maximize my refund? Where do I have to go? And that's where kind of the local government kind of stepped in and tried to spread awareness. But that burden is on the taxpayer. And I think, for more affluent folks, they can sort of pay their way to ease, right, into navigating the system. And that's just not the case for low to moderate income folks. And so I think there's some challenges there. And I think there's some work to be done in terms of simplifying the process. We also had, a pretty funny conversation before this too, around, limited data and how we find these low to moderate income folks. And, we were talking about, how 20% roughly or so don't file who are eligible. And even that data, some folks even question, whether that data is valid or not. And so I think that there's a need for more data, but I think it was funny because we had this conversation about, well, the IRS knows how much I make. They know where I live. They could literally take money out of my bank account if they wanted to, but yet, we're not using sort of the full power of the system to find these people and use the federal government to do some of this outreach. So I think that that's really important. And then the last thing too that I would say, there were a lot of complications and challenges because of COVID. So, these VITA sites provide essential services to Boston residents, and they do a really good job at it. But, COVID made things a little bit more challenging because services that used to be provided in person were now moving online. And so that meant that there were more touch points that needed to happen. The person would come and drop off their, tax paperwork. If the tax preparer had a question or something was wrong, it would, require the person to, get in contact with that tax filer or have them come back to the site. And so I think that there are some challenges there. And I think when we look ahead to the next year, if things are still, not fully 100% in person, there needs to be some preparation work that happens there to make sure that that process is a bit more streamlined.
I love that point. I think we're all at a place where we're looking forward to hopefully the world, quote unquote, returning to, back to the way it was before COVID. And yet I hear you challenging us, Ashley, to assume we're still going to have some issues next year and begin preparing now. So that seems right. Don, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I too am a simple guy. And so for me, it's data, as Ashley was referring to. I hearken back to what the Department of Education did around FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid. You could get data down to the campus level on a bi-weekly basis because there was a political will to do so. And so therefore principals and others could identify folks to actually apply and do outreach and target outreach. So you can't manage what you can't measure. And so we are not able to do the measuring in the prompt enough time. A lot of times the data is 2 to 3 years old by the time you get it. And so that I think is part of the infrastructure package for the IRS, if there is one, is thinking about how to leverage the data that they have to improve outreach and uptake at the local level.
Fantastic.
Could I also just add one thing, Tim, if that's okay?
Absolutely.
I was thinking, I'm reflecting on this panel about, all the work, and this might be, if you want me to save this for later, we can pause, but all the work that's going into, vaccine equity, right? And all the outreach that the federal government is doing to make sure that vulnerable communities can reach the vaccine. They're putting vaccine sites, they're using community health centers, right? Why aren't we doing that for taxes, right? So I think, again, going back to the data, they have the information, and I think that there's a greater role that they can play there.
I think that's just so well said. It feels like as a country, we're more, we understand the concept of equity better today than we did even 18 months ago as an ideal, but applying it to the tax code seems like it's work yet to be done. And when some households have so much more at stake in getting it right, in being connected to the system, in getting what they're due, it just seems to make so much sense that we need to go that extra mile to make sure those are the households that get the resources. What I want to do is, we've touched on the impact of this American Rescue Plan, and let's just get into that a bit, and just to make sure we're all on the same page. In that bill are many, many things. The estimate I've seen is $410 billion going directly to households, primarily through tax provisions. But this includes an enormous expansion of the child tax credit, as we've already talked about, and the beginning of periodic payments. The service says it will begin those in July, as well as, and we'll see the impact of this next tax season when people are filing for 2021 refunds, an expansion of the EITC and the child independent care tax credit, and other provisions I'm probably not remembering right now. And I have to say, at Commonwealth, having worked on financial security for low-income households for years, the number of times we've said some version of, if people just have more money, everything we're trying to do would be that much easier. It's almost one of those things you don't even say out loud anymore because it's so regular a thought. And yet here we have this moment when enormous sums of money are beginning to move. And so with that, I just wanted to take a minute and go around and ask for your thoughts about what are the particular opportunities created by the American Rescue Plan, what are the particular needs, and especially for this audience who are connected to communities, who are used to raising their voice to policymakers, what are the important things they should be thinking about to make sure we get the most possible return on this historic act? Don, I'm gonna come to you first on this one.
Yeah, and I think I do want to just circle back to the point around child poverty, which I think is really somewhat of a moonshot, for reducing child poverty over the next 5 to 10 years if we're able to get it right and we're able to make a lot of these things permanent. And I do think understanding the data and also how to drive uptake, because I think these monthly payments are really, really critical, because I think you're talking about an income smoothing and supplemental mechanism that is likely to have bigger impacts in certain parts of the United States where child poverty is the highest, like the South, right? And where wages are the lowest, right? And where predatory lending is the highest. And so I think the other impacts that I'm really interested to see is kind of what does this do to subprime borrowing as people have, potentially more cushion, on a periodic basis, as opposed to the lump sum, which we know has its, benefits and advantages, but having a lump sum and periodic payments is kind of like having your cake and eating it too. So everyone wants to be able to do that. So I think that's a good thing.
That's great. Fred, what are your What are your thoughts on this moment in the American Rescue Plan?
Well, Tim, I apologize. I'm digressing once again, but I want to pick up on what Don said about data. I strongly recommend reading Professor Brown's book, The Whiteness of Wealth, and how the tax system compounds inequity. It's a fascinating read for a tax person. It's also a fascinating read for everybody else because of the data she pulls together. So in terms of priorities matter, you can't do everything. You can't drain the ocean with a spoon. To me, the single priority is making the child tax credit permanent. That gets exactly what Don is talking about. The future is our kids. We do an awful lot for old folks like me. We don't do nearly what we should for the young kids in this country, especially the vulnerable kids. And that monthly flow of money is transforming. It's transforming like Social Security. It's transforming like Medicare, Medicaid. It's transforming like the EITC. So the single priority, at least in my judgment, should be make it permanent. That's a very heavy political lift. But the other issue is making it administrable. One of the interesting developments is the IRS is always behind. The IRS has all sorts of jobs. And I think it is fair to rethink how to execute permanent. One of the interesting developments from my perspective is Senator Romney, who proposed making it permanent and running it through the Social Security system. Other work, including work that Commonwealth, that Tim and his colleagues are doing, are thinking about different kind of payment platforms. For now, do it with the IRS, get it right, but in the real world, make it permanent and figure out how it's going to work easiest for the folks it's tending to reach. I'm done. That's what should happen, at least in my judgment.
Well, I think that's great, and I'm guessing there are probably many people who are watching today who agree that permanence of these monthly payments is really, would be just a fantastic development. I would also, one thing we've wondered about is, sometimes even a great policy that stumbles out of the gate faces a steeper climb, right, to get institutionalized or made permanent. And with that thought in mind, I am really interested, Ashley, in your perspective as, at least, in the current state, you may be closest to where the rubber meets the road. And I'm curious what your thoughts are about how this enormous new policy rolls out in such a fairly fast time and how we should be thinking about it.
Yeah, well, I think luckily for us, we have a little bit more time than we did with the stimulus bill in December, right, to kind of prepare for this tax season. So that's a plus. But I think I kind of go back, and I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I think, again, more investment and more resources to help us expand our outreach is going to be really, really important. And I also think, planning ahead, right? Trying to sort of understand what the implications for this are on the local level, who is, most important to kind of reach out to. I'm also thinking, as we're sort of talking here, there's people who have been eligible, right, and know they're eligible and they file every year, but because of this legislation, there are folks who were not eligible before who now are, and so that's a whole different ballgame, right, of trying to really find those people and make them more aware of, the impact that this policy can have on their life. So I think it's going to take a lot of work, a lot of planning ahead, and continuing that, collaboration, that coordination that the city of Boston has played in the area.
Oh, that's great. And I think a piece that's come up in all your answers is that this concept of recurring monthly payments, is somewhat new for a tax credit, perhaps entirely new. And so to your point, Ashley, about trying to think how to reach out to different communities, part of the message now needs to be not just file your taxes, a message that, frankly, there's a lot of practice with, but a message about making sure you have provided the right destination to receive those monthly payments. I'm struck by the parallels, Fred, to your comment about, it's no way to run a federal agency not knowing what your budget is from year to year. It's no way to run a household, right? Not knowing what your income is week to week, but that's the reality. And for at least the second half of this year, tens of millions of households will be able to count on these recurring payments. And that should open up possibilities if we can explain what's coming and give people the support to think about what doors that opens. To pick up on one of Don's earlier comments, including something very aspirational like saving for your kids' long-term future. If you knew for certain you were going to have $600 payments coming in for the next 6 months, that might be a moment you've never had before to say, I can afford to put $10 a month aside for this or $50 a month aside for that. So these are all the things we need to think about in the coming weeks. So one theme that's already come up, but I wanted to talk about it explicitly, is the opportunities around racial equity created by this moment. And we've already talked about the enormous sums of money and the fact that we know not all Americans have the same amount at stake in being a part of the tax system. But my sense is maybe there is more we can do to have this moment amount to progress on hundreds of years of racial inequity. And I thought, Ashley, why don't we come back to you first on this one? Is there anything you'd like to add in terms of that question? How do we think about racial equity in the tax system in this moment?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've been thinking about it in sort of two buckets. There's the bigger picture, which I'll let Fred maybe comment on in terms of the systemic changes, right, within the tax code that have been that way for decades and decades and decades, and need some tweaking to sort of really reflect the country that we are now, right? And I also think on the ground, though, more locally, like I'm thinking about like what can I specifically do? And I think what's important for the city is to sort of keep our eyes, and I know I sound like I'm repeating myself here, but making sure that those vulnerable communities can maximize their tax benefits. And that's the most important thing for us. And so, we're over the next, months, we're going to be doing a lot of work around thinking about, how can we improve our outreach efforts now that we have a bit more time to kind of prepare and think about this and understand, the implications of this legislation. How can we reach those vulnerable communities? And I think, what's a good thing is that the pandemic has in some ways provided a nice roadmap for us. Folks are doing these types of outreaches in different ways, vaccine related, testing related, that sort of thing. And so I think there's a lot to learn over the past year as to how do we kind of improve our outreach efforts. But I would say just on the ground, it's really important for us to continue to further our efforts on reaching those vulnerable communities. But I'll leave the high level discussion about tax policy and the system to the experts on the panel.
Thanks, Ashley. Don, let's go to you next on this one. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm actually going to go a little bit of a pivot here to think about the corporate tax system, in particular CRA. And, I know there's been a, Community Reinvestment Act. I know there's been a lot of discussion about, CRA 2.0, what we need to do, particularly around kind of how race and income come together in America, but thinking also just about how we might connect CRA investments to corporate business tax systems, right? Right now, the incentives are pretty light and not really connected very much to the taxes that they pay. And so just really thinking about different ways to direct investment in these communities through a broader understanding of the tax system, just kind of a broader visage of the tax system outside of the personal income filing tax system.
Thank you for that. All right, Fred, you get to round this one out. What are your thoughts on using this moment around racial equity?
Well, I'm a very privileged person. I get to spend a fair amount of time working with Robert Smith on his various initiatives. It's all about the capital, in my judgment, his judgment, which is what matters a hell of a lot more. Getting capital deployed in these communities in ways that work for the communities. And whether you're talking about opportunity zones, whether you're talking about low-income housing tax credit, whether you're talking about new market tax credit, whether you're talking about ways of moving capital into these communities, whether it's education-based, whether it's healthcare based, whether it's community ownership based, whether it's opportunities for all members of the community have ownership interests in community investments. There's so much out there that folks have been experimenting with in all of these areas, job training, and they're all there. And the tax law can play a very important role in getting those kinds of activities where they belong with community-based goals in mind. Investor goals are fine. They want to invest. But those investments done properly through the tax code and the incentives the tax code provides can get the capital where it belongs, serving the communities it should be served. Now that's all blue sky, but those of us who live in the tax world are confident it could be done. And it's a question of whether the Congress has the will.
I think
That's it.
that is a great point for all of us to keep in mind at this particular moment in history. We are coming to the end of our time, but as I've said a couple of times, the way I view this presentation, this panel discussion today is we have the privilege of talking to probably a couple thousand of the most activated, connected, accomplished, resourceful people out there. And so with that in mind, I'd like to just end with a quick lightning round. What's the one thing you think this audience should take away and remember as we leave this conference on the question of how we build an inclusive, impactful tax system? And we'll go Ashley, Don, and Fred. So Ashley, take it away. What's your one thing?
I get two.
Sure.
I think again, it's the resources that the cities and localities need to make the impact that we can, because we're closest to the people. And then secondly, I'm really curious, I mean, advocating for permanent changes, of course, I think the city can play a role in that. And then I'm really interested too in seeing, what is the research and data that comes out of the ARPA, right? After we've expanded the child tax credit, we're, expanding EITC, what have we found that's done? And how can we use that information to make these changes more permanent or advocate for better tax policy? So not one word, but I did my best.
Excellent. Don?
I would totally concur with Fred's recent statement about the importance of, deploying capital in impact-driven ways, something that we're trying to do at Lafayette Square. I think in terms of a big takeaway, I think, once again, I think it is about framing this issue largely around child poverty and economic mobility, and in a public-private, but public meaning interagency approach to child poverty, with taxes near the center of that discussion. And so I think that will help us kind of drive a local, state, national really movement around the connection between taxes, economic security, child poverty, and economic mobility.
Thank you. Fred?
Thanks, Tim. I'm tempted to duck your question, but having seen all of this for a very long time, one of the lessons you learn is exactly what Don said. You get what you measure. Another lesson that you learn, I've learned, I think others have learned in the policy context, is the risk of making the best the enemy of the good. It's a hackneyed phrase, but, and this is not a happy reality, but it is a reality. When Social Security was first enacted, it was drafted intentionally to exclude women and persons of color. When the Fair Labor Standards Act was enacted, it was drafted intentionally to exclude persons of color and women. That was the reality of their time. But look where it's gone. The EITC, if you look at the expansion under Republicans, Democrats, every mix in Congress and the White House, it was a program that addressed poverty, and it worked. And so it was expanded. And I think that keeping that in mind is that in many of these cases, the structure that makes a difference is what matters. The platform matters. The plumbing matters. Because if you get the plumbing right, if you get the platform right, future folks can imagine things we couldn't imagine to build on. If you get universal access to a financial system, think what you can build, like Tim, what you were saying about these payments. And so I think that a clear-eyed view as to what the platform should be, a clear-eyed view as to what is enactable now is important, and then go build on it. That may be a downer, but that's what I believe.
I think that is a fabulous closing comment. I want to really, really, really thank this group for bringing a wide range of perspective to a really interesting conversation. And I will just close with this thought, speaking both personally for myself and from people and institutions I know. I think a lot of us, after a really hard period in the last 18 months, feel like we're coming up on a closing or an ending or a conclusion. And I would actually say it's the opposite. Congress has given us an enormous but incomplete opportunity in the form of the American Rescue Plan Act and what may come ahead. And as exhausted as many people are, understandably, it's on us to see that. And I think this panel's illustrated as an incomplete, but really, really, really historically promising opportunity. And we have to figure out what are the complementary pieces at the community level, in the private sector, in further work from government. At Commonwealth, we want to do that to help people have financial security and savings and to get them into the financial system. And the invite is here to partner with us on that. But you all may have other ways you want to leverage this opportunity. So thank you again. In a moment, we'll have a chance to take some questions, and we look forward to talking further with all of you. Thanks again.
So hello to conference attendees and hello to my fellow panelists. It's really nice to have this opportunity to take some questions directly from the audience. So we'll dive right in. The first question to come across from Katie: how can local advocates support this work? And I assume this work is probably making sure people get the tax credits and tax refunds that they're entitled to. But beyond that, just how to make this tax system inclusive and well served. Ashley, I'm gonna start with you on this one. How can local advocates support this work?
Sounds good. Thanks, Tim. And thanks, Katie, for your question. So what Boston did, and what I think many other cities probably did as well, is partnered with local organizations in the city. So Commonwealth being one of those. And so what we tried to do was basically figure out who are all the different organizations and potential touch points that that folks have with taxpayers, and how can we sort of inform these folks of this policy and of this tax season if they don't already know of it, and try to sort of basically spread our web as far and wide as possible. So we reached out to folks like United Way of Mass Bay because they're very much involved in the tax process. We were communicating to ethnic media outlets to hopefully try to reach folks in those communities. So I think from my perspective, I think local advocates can play a part in spreading the word about tax time and the different credits that low to moderate income folks are entitled to. And I think also playing a role in obviously advocacy at a greater level for some of the policies that we discussed during the panel.
Thank you, Ashley. Fred or Don, is there anything you want to add on this one?
Well, I do think, one thing the American Rescue Plan does provide a pathway for, and obviously this is a pressing issue near and dear to the heart of NCRC, is around the racial wealth divide. There are items in there, not just on the income side, but actually student loan forgiveness, which is a driving force of the racial wealth gap. And so, I think as we go forward and we begin to measure the effects, the impacts of many of these, federal pieces of legislation, I think that we can make a very compelling case for making many of these things permanent. And so, because I think when you start to potentially close the racial wealth divide, making an argument that you want to go back to what things were like before, I think is a very difficult argument to make. And so I think there's an opportunity for us, really within the data, within the measurement, so that we can really assess the impact of not just, the child tax credit, but many of these other, economic payments and benefits to folks. Because I think turning back, whether or not it's on child poverty, the racial wealth gap, I think that's going to be a largely untenable position for those that are opposed to it. And so I would really like that to be, kind of a driving focus for advocates who really care about the racial wealth divide as well as child poverty.
If I could just tag on, I think one thing that's easy to overlook is that getting stories into your local media about the impact that these refunds and these, particularly the expansion of the child tax credit, what impact that's having, is actually really, really helpful to see that pop up in your hometown newspaper. It doesn't have to be the New York Times or the Washington Post or USA Today. Advocates, including very sophisticated advocates in Washington, can find and use those local stories. And so I would just say it's on all of us to tell the story about what's working and what's being impactful, and to sort of assume that there'll be a lot of forces that will naturally be looking for where it doesn't work or where something went wrong. It's sort of a rule of the universe. Those stories get a lot of attention, and it's going to take all of us to make sure that the impact side is highlighted.
Yeah. Tim,
Fred,
I
go
guess
ahead.
I would say this is very brief. Vote, volunteer, and now's the time. Take it. That's my advice. Listen to Don and Ashley. I'm just mainly BS, but they know what they're doing.
That's eloquent. Well, Fred, the next question I think is one you might want to answer, and that was if you could say a little bit more about the book that you referenced, Dorothy Brown's book, maybe just the title and the author and a word or two about why you recommended it. I think the audience would appreciate that.
Sure, Tim, and a lot of it is sort of deep tax dive geek stuff, but she captures some critically important things. And what she focuses on is not abstract. The inequity we see today obviously started with slavery. That is a fact. But then you get past the Civil War and you look at the Homestead Act. You look at Social Security and FLSA when it was enacted. You look at the GI Bill. And these are objective facts. You can't argue with them. All you have to do is read the law. And that is the source, the continuing source of the wealth gap and inequity in this country. And you may want to run, but you can't hide from those facts. And that's, it's a very compelling case. But the other part of the story she tells is that the effects of our various systems reach beyond just persons of color. The white families in the Midwest that have been victims of the opiate crisis. And the challenge of figuring out what solutions should be universal and what should be targeted is a challenge. And she makes all of this clear, at least for me, in a way that hadn't seen that clarity before.
Thank you. And again, I believe the book is, the author is Dorothy Brown, and I believe the title is The Color of Wealth. But
No, Tim, it's the whiteness of wealth.
the whiteness of wealth. Thank you very much. We have another question, Don. This one's directed to you from Fran. Don, you preach data, data, data. What will the stats look like when the racial wealth divide is better? How will we identify when what we're doing works? You take that big one on?
I will attempt to. I do think we have to get better and more frequent about measuring the racial wealth gap. I am not very satisfied with the intervals and the frequency, the type of data that is used. I do think that we need a reboot in terms of how we measure wealth, particularly as it pertains to race. And so I think that is a very, very important step before we can actually begin to actually measure the impact of many of these measures, right? I just think the 3-year interval, the way it's done, the lack of really good local data around that. And so I think I would really kind of challenge some of my data scientists in the field to really kind of reimagine the way that we measure wealth in this country so that we can measure it in a much more efficient and timely manner so that we're not behind the curve when the advocacy time comes.
Thanks, Don. And I'll just observe, one thing smarter people than me have pointed out is that we have to keep track of our income every year as part of the tax filing process, right? But we don't report our wealth, and there are probably good reasons for that. But it's just a fundamentally different public use case of the data. Well, I think we're coming up on the end of the time. I want to just do one quick round and ask if there's any final thought, especially knowing, for example, that the American Families Plan now includes a provision to extend the child tax credit for, I believe it's another 5 years. Is there any final piece of advice that our audience should take back to their work in their communities that can help make that come to pass, the permanence of that expansion? Fred, I'm going to start with you, then we'll go to Ashley, and Don will give you the last word.
I don't know what the rules are about what one can say about political action, so I'm not going to volunteer anything.
All right. Well, I think sometimes that says more than saying the actual thing. Ashley?
Yeah. So I think for us, again, it's about trying to maximize this policy on the ground, right? What's written doesn't always end up happening on the ground, and so it's sort of our jobs to make sure that happens. But I would also say, and this is sort of tangentially related, but I think that there's a real opportunity here to take the child tax credit expansion and the expansion of the EITC and really sort of double down on some other efforts, right, around financial empowerment and that sort of thing. So if you're going to have this, tax time touch point, what other services can we provide? What other sort of tools and resources can we give tax filers to help them build wealth or become more economically mobile? So I think that's going to be certainly a focus for us.
Great.
I'm going to, really kind of double down on what I've said previously around the importance of framing some of these issues within the child poverty framework. I think that, there is a good history, I think, in this country of whether or not we're talking about the elderly, right, and poverty. The war on poverty effectively cut poverty in half, over a period of time. And so I think there's a lot more bipartisan support. If you think about, really trying to defend the existing level of child poverty or wanting to go back to where it was, pre the expansion of the child tax credit. So I do think that there's a tremendous opportunity to really frame this issue around eliminating child poverty. I mean, I think that we, as a moonshot, as a long range goal, I think it is certainly possible to dream that scenario. And so I think that that is something that can animate quite a few advocates, but also, as I said before, garner some level of bipartisan support because it's really hard to argue that child poverty is good for the United States of America.
And Don, the thing you said a couple minutes ago is on my mind, that sometimes it's really hard to take things away, and I think there is something that we can all sort of factor that into how we approach this work, how we talk about this work, how we explain the impact. And one thing we've even wondered a little bit on my team, if the financial services industry, for example, recognizes how powerful it is to have tens of thousands of families or tens of millions of families receiving recurring monthly payments, that's not a bad thing. That helps to create that sense that this is here, and and a lot of different stakeholders recognize its value. So we need to think about, in my view, those who are sympathetic to the cause, and we need to think about other stakeholders who can recognize that this is in their interest. So I think we are at time. Fred, were you trying to get a word in? I couldn't tell if you were raising your eyebrow the way somebody at an auction does, trying to signal. All right. Now I want to just take this moment to thank all of you again for making the time to join us and have a really lively conversation, and really thank the audience for tuning in and listening and sort of joining us and thinking together about how we make the most of this moment and create the kind of inclusive tax system that attacks child poverty, that gives people financial security and opportunity, that attacks the racial wealth gap and inequity. And so I look forward to working with all of you to see that make progress towards those goals. Thank you.